Hey everyone, nice to see you all again. This is the fourth episode about PBR texture maps in Blender. In this video, we'll take a look at the Ambient Occlusion map and understand what Ambient Occlusion actually is. Let's begin. An Ambient Occlusion (AO) map is a grayscale image that tells Blender how much ambient light reaches different parts of a surface. White areas are completely open and remain unaffected. Black areas are fully blocked from ambient light, often in creases or corners, and appear dark. Gray areas fall somewhere in between, representing partial occlusion. This mimics the real-world phenomenon where surfaces that are close together receive less light and appear darker. For example, when you read a book, the crease in the middle always looks darker no matter the lighting. In a pile of folded clothes, the deeper folds and the places where the layers press together always look darker, even without direct shadows. Cracks in a surface appear much darker as the light has a harder time reaching these narrow gaps. I refer to this as a phenomenon instead of ambient occlusion because, in the real world, the term AO isn't commonly used. We would rather call it light falloff, light attenuation, shading, or something similar. AO is a concept designed to replicate or simulate these effects, specifically for shading and rendering in 3D computer graphics. Blender and many other 3D software simulate this effect by darkening areas where surfaces are in close proximity to each other. This shading can then be baked into a texture map based on the occluded areas at the time of baking. The most common way to use an AO map in Blender is to add a mix color node between the color map and the principal shader. Then plug the AO map into the second slot of the mix color node and set the mix mode to multiply. Using multiply, Blender takes the first input and darkens it based on the second input. It uses non-color space because it only represents where the darkening should happen, not represent color. This adds more detail to 3D models and can make them appear more realistic. That said, this effect just fakes how light behaves in the real world and is actually blended onto the material's base color. This means it doesn't respond to changes in lighting, which is its biggest limitation. Even under direct light, the darkening remains. However, from a performance perspective, it can be advantageous, as no complex lighting calculations are required to generate it. So, AO is a great way to add extra depth to your renders or give them a more stylized look. Just keep in mind that the effect is not physically accurate and should be used with caution, especially when realism is important. In fact, AO maps are often unnecessary. Cycles, for example, uses ray tracing, which naturally simulates lighting interactions such as ambient occlusion. For instance, another classic case of the phenomenon, which we refer to as ambient occlusion in 3D, can be seen at the edges and corners of a room. This image shows the ceiling of my apartment, lit only by ambient light from the large window below. Next, I modeled a simplified version of this enclosed space in Blender using the window as the only light source. While the lighting and perspective aren't an exact match, the key point is that Cycles does a pretty good job replicating the natural darkening that occurs in the room's edges and corners. The ambient occlusion I've discussed so far, typically seen in texture maps, occurs in creases, folds, cracks, and corners. But what ambient occlusion tries to replicate can also be observed on a larger scale. Here the ground shadow comes from the directly blocked sunlight, but the fully enclosed section appears even darker because ambient light struggles to reach it. In this abandoned warehouse, light from the overcast sky partially illuminates the space, but as you move deeper inside, it grows progressively darker because the light has difficulty reaching those areas. A car will cast a dark shadow underneath it, even if it's parked in the shade, especially near the wheels where it's closest to the ground. So, shadows in the real world are not one single uniform shade of darkness. Instead, they form a gradient, becoming darker the closer two surfaces get to each other, or in enclosed areas where ambient light struggles to reach. This phenomenon can be subtle and hard to distinguish from regular shadows, but the key difference is that regular shadows are cast by direct light, while ambient occlusion, as the name implies, refers to ambient, indirect light being blocked or occluded by nearby surfaces. Using the car example, this effect can also be demonstrated in Blender. In this scene, the car is lit by both the sunlight and a neutral overcast HDRI. With the sunlight directed at the car, a clear shadow is cast by the direct light, but within that shadow, darker areas appear where ambient light struggles to reach. These darker areas are more noticeable when the car is close to the ground, but when the car is raised, only the shadow from the direct sunlight remains. This effect becomes clearer when the sunlight is turned off. With only the ambient light from the HDRI, the shadows beneath the car are purely from ambient occlusion. This is caused by ambient light being obstructed. When the car is raised, this ambient occlusion shadow disappears. So far, most of what I've covered has been in Cycles, since it handles lighting more realistically. In Cycles, light rays are physically traced as they bounce around the scene. This is called path tracing. It simulates global illumination, which refers to how light interacts with surfaces indirectly in a 3D scene, by letting light rays bounce around until they fade. And many of the light rays struggle to reach tight spaces. Ambient occlusion is a natural result of this process, creating soft, realistic shadows and gradual darkening in enclosed areas. But let's briefly look at how ambient occlusion works in Eevee. As of Blender 4.2, Eevee's fast GI approximation includes a new global illumination option that uses ray tracing. It replaces the older ambient occlusion method, which estimated shadows using only surface depth and normals. The new system takes the full 3D geometry into account, resulting in more realistic ambient shadows and indirect lighting. However, Eevee doesn't use full path tracing like Cycles. The number of bounces is limited, so it applies darkening based on the proximity to nearby surfaces, but the rays don't continue bouncing to create the natural fade into occluded spaces like we see in Cycles. As a result, occluded areas can also appear flatter. There are plenty of tutorials out there on how to make Eevee look more like Cycles, so I won't go too deep into that here. But that's exactly why AO maps are often baked in engines like Cycles, so that they can be used in engines like Eevee to fake the soft gradients and subtle shadowing that Cycles produces naturally, but without any complex lighting calculations. So does that mean that AO maps are useless in Cycles? Not really. One of the most useful things about ambient occlusion is that it appears exactly where grime, dust, rust, dirt, and wear tend to build up, which makes AO maps perfect for using as masks when adding those kinds of details. There are a couple of ways to do this. First, let's go back to the earlier example, where we blended ambient occlusion with the base color. We can take the output from that setup and plug it into the bottom input of a mix color node set to mix, with a dirt color in the top input. We use mix this time because we don't want to darken the top input like multiply does. We want to blend the dirt color into the areas where the ambient occlusion is. Then, use the AO map again as the factor, and add a color ramp to control the intensity and falloff of the dirt effect. Next, ambient occlusion is often also used in the same way in procedural setups, using the ambient occlusion node available in the shader editor. This node darkens areas where geometry is close together, simulating shadowing in creases and corners. In an upcoming tutorial about creating a lucky cat in Blender, I combine it with a noise texture to add dirt in specific areas. That output can then be plugged into a mix color node set to mix, with one input as the base color and the other as the dirt color. But it's also important to note that in Cycles, the ambient occlusion node can be slow and increase render times because it's more complex to calculate. To save time, you can use the pointiness output from the geometry node for a similar effect, or use the baked AO texture like I showed earlier. Both options are faster and might be worth considering depending on your project. But I'll cover more about procedural textures in another tutorial. That's everything I wanted to cover about ambient occlusion. Hope you're still with me. In the next video, we'll dive into the opacity map. If you found this video helpful, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, I'll see you next time.